The chalk hit the blackboard with a sharp, authoritative crack that echoed through the cavernous expanse of the Weston Lecture Hall, a sound designed not to educate, but to dominate and subjugate the minds in the room. Professor Alistair Sterling stood before the massive slate, his tailored charcoal suit immaculate, his posture radiating an unearned aristocratic superiority as he stared down at the 90 graduate students who had paid a small fortune just to breathe the same rarefied academic air. Sterling was the crown jewel of the Oxford Mathematics Department, a man who had built his entire career on a single theoretical paper published 2 decades ago and had spent every day since protecting his fragile legacy by crushing anyone who dared to question his intellect. He pressed the chalk harder against the board, drawing a final jagged line under a sprawling labyrinth of complex variables and nonlinear differential equations that stretched across 3 massive sliding panels. "This is the whale conjecture," he announced, his voice a dry, aristocratic drawl that dripped with condescension. "It has remained unsolved for 40 years, and frankly, looking at the absolute state of this current cohort, I expect it will remain unsolved for 40 more. He turned his back on the silent, terrified students and smirked. "Class dismissed," he muttered, dropping the chalk onto the wooden tray with a dismissive clatter. The students scrambled to pack their leather satchels, desperate to escape the suffocating weight of his ego, leaving the hall in a rushed, frantic silence. But standing in the shadows at the very back of the hall, near the heavy brass doors, was a man who did not move. Elias Thorne, a 34-year-old man wearing a faded gray custodian uniform, held a heavy industrial push broom in his calloused hands, his eyes locked onto the blackboard. Elias did not see a random assortment of numbers and Greek letters. He saw a language he spoke more fluently than English, a beautiful, intricate symphony of logic that was screaming a fundamental truth. He leaned against the wooden handle of his broom, his dark eyes scanning the sprawling equation, reading the math like a master musician reading a lost Beethoven score. Sterling, wiping his hands on a pristine linen handkerchief, caught sight of the custodian lingering in the doorway. "You there!" Sterling barked, snapping his fingers as if summoning a stray dog. "Do not just stand there, staring at things you could not possibly comprehend. Grab your little mop and clean up the chalk dust. I have a symposium tomorrow, and I will not have this hall looking like a public house." Elias blinked, pulling himself out of the mathematical trance, his grip tightening on the broom handle just a fraction of an inch. "Yes, Professor Sterling," he said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone, smooth and devoid of the deference Sterling expected. "I will clean it up immediately." Sterling scoffed, shaking his head as he packed his leather briefcase. "See that you do, and try not to smudge the board with your dirty hands. The math on that slate is worth more than you will earn in 100 lifetimes." Sterling marched up the central aisle, his expensive leather shoes clicking sharply on the hardwood, leaving a trail of expensive cologne and cheap cruelty in his wake. Elias watched him go, his face an absolute mask of stoic calm. He did not yell. He did not clench his fists. He simply walked down to the front of the hall, picked up his dustpan, and began to sweep the floor. "Man, I have to pause right here because this setup is exactly how the world operates, and it makes me sick to my stomach. You have this arrogant professor who thinks a degree and a tweed jacket make him a god, looking at a man holding a broom and assuming that man has absolutely nothing going on inside his head. He thinks Elias is just a pair of hands meant to clean up his messes. But what Sterling does not know, what nobody at that prestigious university knows, is that the man pushing that broom is hiding a mind that could shatter the entire foundation of modern mathematics. They handed the smartest man in the building a mop and told him to stay quiet. Let's get into it. To truly understand how Elias Thorne ended up in a gray uniform scraping gum off the bottoms of antique desks, you have to look past the prestigious spires of Oxford and go back to a cramped, damp council flat in East London, where the heat barely worked and the electricity was a luxury. Elias grew up the oldest of 4 siblings, raised by a single mother who worked 3 jobs just to keep the bailiffs from kicking down their door. He was a prodigy, the kind of once-in-a-generation genius that tests off the charts by the time they are 8 years old. While other children were playing in the streets, Elias was sitting on the fire escape, reading discarded university textbooks he salvaged from the local recycling bins, teaching himself advanced calculus and theoretical physics by the light of a street lamp. Numbers were his refuge. They were the only thing in his chaotic, desperate world that made absolute, perfect sense. By the time he was 18, he was offered a full merit scholarship to Cambridge, an unconditional offer that should have been his golden ticket out of poverty. But life does not care about your genius when the rent is due. 2 weeks before he was supposed to leave for university, his mother suffered a massive, debilitating stroke, leaving her entirely paralyzed on her left side. There was no safety net. There was no trust fund. There was only Elias. He looked at the acceptance letter, holding his future in his hands, and he quietly folded it up and put it in a drawer. He took a job working the night shift at a shipping warehouse, loading crates, for 12 hours a day to pay for his mother's medical care and keep his younger sisters in school. He sacrificed his entire future so his family could survive. For 16 years, Elias worked with his hands lifting, carrying, pushing, sweating his brilliance locked away in a dark corner of his mind. When his mother finally passed away and his sisters graduated and moved on, Elias found himself in his early 30s, living in a tiny rented room, exhausted and invisible to the world. He took the custodial job at Oxford, not because he wanted to be near academia, but because the union benefits covered his lingering medical debts and the night shift allowed him to work in absolute silence. But being surrounded by blackboards covered in high-level mathematics was both a blessing and a torture. Every night, he would walk through the empty lecture halls, smelling the chalk dust and the old wood, staring at the equations left behind by the professors running the proofs in his head, finding the errors, identifying the shortcuts, seeing the brilliant, elegant truths that the highly paid academics completely missed. He never touched the chalk. He never left a mark. He just cleaned the floors and kept his head down. But the whale conjecture that Sterling had written on the board was different. It was not just an equation, it was a locked door, and Elias could see the keyhole. Professor Alistair Sterling was a man who lived his entire life behind a facade of intellectual superiority, terrified that someone would discover he had not had an original thought in 20 years. He was scheduled to host the International Symposium on Applied Mathematics that weekend, a massive globally televised academic event where he was expected to present a keynote address. He had put the whale conjecture on his board not to solve it, but to use it as a prop, a visual intimidation tactic to make himself look like a tortured genius wrestling with the secrets of the universe. Sterling treated his graduate students like indentured servants, stealing their research, putting his name on their papers, and destroying the careers of anyone who challenged his authority. Just the week before, he had stood in the center of the faculty dining room and systematically humiliated a brilliant young postdoc named Sarah Jenkins, mocking her dissertation on topological manifolds until she left the room in tears. Elias had been emptying the trash bins near their table and heard every single cruel, venomous word. He had watched Sterling laugh with his colleagues, sipping a 200-pound bottle of wine, reveling in his ability to crush a younger, sharper mind. Sterling was a parasite, feeding on the ambition of others while contributing absolutely nothing to the world. And now this parasite was standing on a global stage, claiming he was on the verge of solving a 40-year-old mathematical mystery. Elias knew Sterling was nowhere close. In fact, looking at the board, Elias could see that Sterling's foundational premise was fundamentally flawed. Sterling was trying to force a linear progression onto a system that was inherently chaotic, like trying to map a 3-dimensional galaxy using a flat piece of paper. It was clumsy, it was arrogant, and it offended Elias on a deeply personal level. Math was beautiful, and Sterling was treating it like a cheap parlor trick. The escalation happened on a Thursday evening, 2 days before the massive symposium. Elias was assigned to deep clean the Weston Lecture Hall, a grueling 4-hour task that involved polishing the wood paneling and scrubbing the tiered seating. He was working near the front of the room, a bucket of soapy water at his feet, when the heavy brass doors swung open. Sterling walked in, accompanied by 2 visiting dignitaries from a prestigious American university. Sterling was holding court, gesturing wildly, talking loudly about his grueling work on the conjecture. Yes, it is a stubborn beast, Sterling boasted, his voice echoing in the empty hall. But I believe I have cornered the primary variable. I just need to isolate the transitional matrix, and the Nobel Committee will be giving me a call. The 2 Americans chuckled politely, looking at the massive board covered in dense, chaotic chalk. It looks completely impenetrable, one of them noted. Sterling smirked, adjusting his tie. Only to the untrained mind, he replied smugly. He then noticed Elias kneeling by the front row, scrubbing a scuff mark off the floor. Sterling sighed loudly, making a dramatic show of his annoyance. Good God, man, are you still in here? I specifically requested this hall be pristine for tomorrow morning. Elias stopped scrubbing, keeping his eyes on the floor. I am almost finished, Professor, he said quietly. Well, hurry it up, Sterling snapped, and stay away from the front stage. The air currents from your dusty broom are probably disturbing the chalk on my board. The visiting professors laughed a cruel, dismissive sound. Sterling leaned in closer to his guests, lowering his voice but keeping it just loud enough for Elias to hear. It is tragic, really, watching the lower classes pretend they are contributing to society. They are little more than biological machines designed for menial labor. Elias froze, his calloused hands gripping the scrub brush so hard the wooden handle groaned under the pressure. He felt the familiar burn of rage in his chest, the primal urge to stand up to grab Sterling by his tailored lapels and expose him for the hollow, arrogant fraud he was. But Elias breathed out slow and controlled, pushing the anger down, locking it in a box. He did not say a word. He did not look up. He simply resumed scrubbing the floor, moving the brush in tight, perfect, geometric circles. He waited until Sterling and his guests strutted out of the room, laughing and congratulating themselves, before he finally stood up and walked over to the blackboard. He stood there for 10 minutes, just staring at the sprawling, chaotic mess of Sterling's math. It was a disaster, an insult to logic. The transitional matrix was not isolated, it was collapsed. Sterling was not on the verge of a breakthrough. He was driving a theoretical train into a concrete wall. Elias knew how to fix it. He had known how to fix it since he first saw the equation 3 days ago. He walked over to his janitorial cart, reached into the deep pocket of his gray uniform, and pulled out a small, battered leather notebook. The pages were yellowed and filled margin to margin with tiny, precise handwriting, elegant proofs, completely original theorems, calculations that surpassed anything published in the last decade. He flipped to a blank page, pulled a stub of a pencil from behind his ear, and began to write. He did not write the answer, he wrote the bridge. He wrote the exact sequence of nonlinear derivations required to untangle Sterling's mess and guide the equation toward a stable, elegant solution. He worked in the dim light of the lecture hall, his mind operating at a velocity that would have terrified the men who had just mocked him. When he finished the proof, took up exactly 2 pages, he looked at his notebook, then he looked at the massive blackboard. He walked over to the wooden tray, picked up a fresh piece of white chalk, and stood before the center panel. He did not erase Sterling's work. He did not want to hide the professor's failure. Instead, he found the exact point where Sterling's logic collapsed, circled it in a stark, unforgiving white line, and drew an arrow pointing to a blank section of the slate. And then the black janitor raised his hand and began to write. He wrote with a fluid, relentless speed, the chalk clacking against the board in a rapid-fire staccato rhythm, a sound like a machine gun in the empty room. He bypassed the linear progression, entirely shifting the entire equation into a multidimensional topological space, utilizing a variant of string theory math that had not even been formally published yet. He was not just solving the problem, he was dismantling the problem, reinventing the rules of the game, and forcing the universe to reveal its secrets. The math flowed out of him like water bursting from a broken dam, years of repressed genius pouring onto the slate in a brilliant, glowing cascade of logic. He did not pause to calculate, he did not second guess, he simply translated the perfect truth from his mind to the physical world. When he wrote the final variable, closing the proof, with an undeniably elegant definitive conclusion, he stopped. His chest was heaving, a thin layer of sweat coated his forehead. His fingers were covered in white dust. He stepped back and looked at the board. It was a masterpiece, a genuine, undeniable work of high art. He dropped the chalk onto the tray where it landed with a soft, definitive click. He picked up his bucket, grabbed his mop, turned off the overhead lights, and walked out of the Weston Lecture Hall, leaving his brilliance waiting in the dark. Let us stop and appreciate the magnitude of this exact moment. He did not leave a note. He did not sign his name. He did not leave an email address asking for a scholarship. He just left the truth sitting there on the wall. He basically walked into the throne room, looked at the king's broken crown, fixed it with a hammer, and walked out the back door without saying a word. That is not just genius, that is absolute savage confidence. He knows the math is perfect, and he knows that when morning comes, that room is going to absolutely explode. Let's see what happens. The next morning, at exactly 6:30, Professor Alistair Sterling walked into the Weston Lecture Hall carrying a cup of expensive artisan coffee, rehearsing his opening remarks for the symposium. He switched on the main lights, walked down the center aisle, and looked up at his blackboard. He froze. The coffee cup slipped from his fingers, hitting the floor and shattering, sending hot, dark liquid splashing across his polished shoes. He didn't notice. His mouth hung open, his eyes wide with a manic, frantic shock as he stared at the center panel of the slate. He saw his own work, his collapsed, flawed logic, circled and humiliated. And then he saw the continuation. Sterling was an arrogant man and a lazy academic, but he had enough foundational knowledge to recognize pure, undeniable truth when it slapped him in the face. He stepped closer, tracking the nonlinear derivations, following the topological shift, his heart hammering in his chest like a trapped bird. He read the final line, the elegant, undeniable solution to the whale conjecture. It was perfect. It was a revolution. It was the kind of mathematics that won Nobel Prizes and secured a place in history books for a century, and Sterling had absolutely no idea who wrote it. He whipped his head around, scanning the empty hall, panic rising in his throat. Who had been in here? Who had seen this? Was it one of the visiting Americans? Was it Sarah Jenkins getting her revenge? He ran to the door, checked the hallway, sprinted back to the board. His mind raced, calculating the variables of his own survival. In exactly 3 hours, 300 of the brightest mathematical minds on the planet were going to walk into this room to hear him speak. If someone else claimed this proof right here on his board, he would be a laughingstock, his entire career exposed as a fraud. But there was no name. There was no signature, just the math. Sterling's panic slowly warped into a dark, opportunistic greed. A slow, chilling smile crept across his face. The chalk was in his room. The equation was on his board. Therefore, it was his equation. It was his proof. He quickly grabbed an eraser and carefully wiped away the harsh circle the unknown genius had drawn around his mistake, blending the new, flawless math seamlessly into his own opening sequence. He grabbed a fresh piece of chalk and quickly traced over a few of the new variables, subtly altering the handwriting to match his own sloppy script. He was going to steal it. He was going to steal the most important mathematical discovery of the decade and parade it in front of the world as his own crowning achievement. He spent the next 2 hours frantically memorizing the steps, trying to understand the leaps in logic, sweating through his tweed suit, terrified that he would forget a transition, terrified that someone would ask him to explain a mechanic he did not fully comprehend. By 9 o'clock, the hall was packed. The air was thick with anticipation. Cameras were set up in the aisles, broadcasting the symposium to universities across the globe. Sterling stood at the podium looking out at a sea of esteemed colleagues, eager journalists, and terrified graduate students. He adjusted his microphone, cleared his throat, and began the performance of his life. Ladies and gentlemen, he intoned his voice, echoing with manufactured gravitas. For 40 years, the whale conjecture has defeated the greatest minds of our generation. We have crashed against its walls, we have stumbled in its dark corridors. But today I stand before you to say that the walls have fallen. I have found the solution. A murmur of shocked disbelief rippled through the massive crowd. Sterling dramatically stepped away from the podium, grabbing a wooden pointer and gesturing to the massive blackboard behind him. He walked them through the proof, reciting the steps he had memorized that morning, projecting an aura of supreme intellectual dominance. He pointed to the topological shift, the brilliant multidimensional bypass Elias had created, and claimed it as his own midnight epiphany. I was staring at the problem for days. Sterling lied smoothly, and then it hit me: simply shift the spatial parameters. It is quite elementary, really, once you elevate your mind past the standard literature. The crowd was mesmerized. Pens were scratching furiously across notepads, cameras were flashing, professors were shaking their heads in sheer awe. Standing in the shadows at the very back of the hall, leaning against the heavy brass doors, holding a dustcloth in his hand, was Elias Thorne. He watched Sterling parade across the stage. He listened to the man steal his life's work, taking credit for the blood and sweat Elias had poured onto that board in the dead of night. Elias's face remained a mask of stone, his jaw clamped tight, his dark eyes burning holes through Sterling's expensive suit. He did not shout, he did not interrupt, he simply watched the thief build a massive house of cards on a stage in front of the entire world. Sterling finished his presentation, pointing to the final elegant variable, and the hall erupted in a thunderous standing ovation, the applause deafening a wave of pure adoration washing over the stage. Sterling bowed, soaking in the glory, his ego inflating to catastrophic proportions. He raised his hands, asking for silence. Thank you, Sterling beamed. I will now take a few questions regarding my proof. The room fell silent. Hands shot up into the air. Sterling pointed to a man in the second row, Dr. Heinrich Vance, a notoriously brutal and brilliant mathematician from MIT, a man who did not suffer fools. Vance stood up, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses, looking directly at Sterling. Professor Sterling Vance began, his voice sharp and precise. The topological shift you utilized in the fourth quadrant is undeniably brilliant. However, it relies on a multidimensional variable translation that skips 3 standard derivation steps. You jumped from an unstable matrix directly into a locked topological constant. It works on the board, but the bridge is missing. Explain to us the specific mechanic you used to stabilize the variable during the dimensional shift, because quite frankly, looking at your previous published work, this level of intuitive geometry seems wildly out of your wheelhouse. The room went dead silent. The air vanished. Sterling froze. The smug smile slid off his face, crashing to the floor. The pointer in his hand trembled. He looked at the board, staring at the fourth quadrant. He knew what the math said, he had memorized the symbols, but he had absolutely no idea how they connected. He did not understand the bridge because he had not built the bridge. The silence stretched, agonizing, tight, unbearable. Sterling opened his mouth, closed. It opened it again. Well, Dr. Vance, it is a highly complex intuitive leap, Sterling stammered, sweat pouring down his temples. It is difficult to vocalize. Without a much longer lecture, I simply applied a standard tensor field, and well, the math resolved itself. Dr. Vance did not blink. That is not an answer, Professor Vance said coldly. A tensor field would collapse the matrix instantly. If you wrote this proof, you can explain the bridge. Do it! The camera zoomed in on Sterling's terrified face. 300 geniuses were looking at him, watching the Emperor suddenly realize he was not wearing any clothes. Sterling was drowning, completely paralyzed by a problem he could not steal his way out of. From the back of the hall, a deep, calm, gravelly voice cut through the heavy silence like a machete. He did not use a tensor field, he used a non-commutative algebraic framework combined with a fractional calculus derivative. Every head in the room whipped around, the cameras pivoted, 300 pairs of eyes stared at the back of the auditorium. Elias Thorne stepped out of the shadows, still wearing his gray custodian uniform, holding his yellow dustcloth. The room gasped in collective shock. Security guards rushed forward, but Dr. Vance raised a hand, stopping them. Let him speak! Vance commanded, his eyes locked on Elias. Sterling was gripping the podium, his knuckles white, sheer terror radiating from his eyes. You Sterling, shrieked, his voice cracking. Get him out of here. He is a madman. He cleans the toilets. Call the police. Elias ignored him. He walked slowly down the central aisle, his boots making a steady, heavy, rhythmic sound against the hardwood. He did not look at the crowd. He did not look at the cameras. He looked directly at the blackboard. He reached the front of the hall, bypassed the security guards, walked up the wooden stairs, and stepped onto the stage, right next to the trembling, panicked Oxford professor. Elias did not ask for permission. He reached out and took the piece of white chalk from the tray. He looked at Dr. Vance. The standard dimensional shift collapses because you assume time is a linear constant. Elias explained, his voice echoing through the silent hall, smooth, powerful, and absolutely authoritative. But if you decouple the temporal variable and apply a fractional derivative, you force the matrix to fold back on itself, stabilizing the geometry before the collapse can occur. Like this. Elias turned to a blank section of the board and began to write. He did not write the 2-page proof, he wrote the hidden architecture, the invisible foundational math that supported the brilliant leap. He wrote faster than any professor in the room could process his chalk, flying across the slate, filling the empty space with a symphony of numbers, proving not only that the solution was correct, but proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that he was the absolute master of the language. The entire room watched in stunned, silent awe as a man in a janitor's uniform delivered a masterclass in theoretical physics that made their entire expensive educations look like a primary school lesson. Elias finished the bridge, drawing a definitive line connecting his new derivations directly into the final elegant solution. He dropped the chalk onto the tray, dusted his hands on his gray pants, and turned back to Dr. Vance. "That is the bridge," Elias said, simply. Dr. Vance stared at the board, his mouth slightly open, reading the math, calculating the logic. A slow, amazed smile spread across his face. He looked at Elias and nodded his head in a gesture of absolute profound respect. "It is flawless," Vance whispered. "It is absolutely flawless." The hall erupted. Not polite applause, but sheer chaotic pandemonium. Reporters were shouting questions, professors were jumping out of their seats, scrambling toward the stage, cameras were flashing blinding light across the room. Sterling had collapsed into a chair behind the podium, his head in his hands, his career, his legacy, his entire identity completely obliterated in front of a global audience. The man who had spent his life crushing others had been atomized by a custodian armed with a piece of chalk. Elias did not smile, he did not gloat, he did not wait for the press. He turned around, walked down the stage stairs, pushed through the crowd of stunned academics, and walked out the heavy brass doors of the lecture hall, leaving his dustcloth sitting neatly on the edge of Sterling's podium. Real talk? This is the definition of poetic justice delivered at maximum velocity. Sterling tried to use a working-class man as a stepping stone, and that man turned around and dropped a mountain on him. You cannot steal true brilliance. You can copy the words, you can forge the signature, but when the fire gets hot, when the world demands an explanation, the fraud will always burn and the truth will always stand. The aftermath was swift and absolute. Professor Alistair Sterling was forced to resign in disgrace, his previous papers subjected to massive audits revealing decades of stolen research and fabricated data. He lost his tenure, his reputation, and vanished from the academic world entirely a ghost of his own making. The Oxford Math Department, desperate to save face and scrambling to secure the mind of a century, immediately launched a massive search for the brilliant custodian. Elias Thorne did not return to his closet. He was sitting on a park bench in East London 3 days later, watching the pigeons when the Dean of Oxford and Dr. Vance personally arrived in a black town car, offering him a full tenured fellowship, a dedicated research lab, and an unconditional apology. Elias took the job not for the title, not for the tweed jacket, but because the math was finally free and he would never have to hide it in a battered notebook again. He walked into his new corner office overlooking the historic courtyard wearing a simple black sweater and jeans, a stark contrast to the pretentious suits of his colleagues. On his massive oak desk, right next to his glowing computer monitor, sat a small, clear acrylic box. Inside the box was not a medal, not an award, but a faded gray plastic name tag reading Elias Thorne Custodial Services. A permanent reminder that the greatest minds do not always come from privilege, they do not always wear the right clothes, and they do not always ask for permission to change the world. Sometimes they just pick up the chalk. If this story hit you in the chest, if you have ever been underestimated, ignored, or told to stay in your place, smash that like button, share this with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe right now. Keep building in silence, keep perfecting your craft, and when the time comes, take the chalk and make them watch.